Hello friends, we are running a series called Indian Writing in English, and in this series already 3-4 recordings have been done, and the team that we are, Dr. Richa Bajaj, Professor Nupur Chawla, and of course our own expert Professor Payal Nagpal. We have been, we have already started the series with certain lectures, and since the other two lectures were about the general idea of what Indian writing in English means, what it stands for, what its character is. So, in the meantime, Professor Nagpal last time had also given a lecture on Kamala Das, keeping in view the requirements of the series. But I thought that we should have a general view of Professor Payal Nagpal here on Indian writing in English, and that particular lapse now is being corrected today. I requested Professor Payal Nagpal to give us a general view of what Indian writing in English means to us, what its appeal is, what its inspiration is, what its quality and its relevance is. So for all these things, I requested her and she kindly agreed. And today then, we can take text maybe next time, but let's have a general view of Professor Payal Nagpal on Indian writing in English. So now with that, we over to you, Professor Nagpal. Welcome.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. And yes, certainly it's a good idea to actually have a discussion on the term Indian writing in English itself. Our series is titled Understanding Indian English Literatures, but here we are going to bring in, as part of the series, both texts written originally in English and also those that are available in from the bhashas and their translations into translation into the English language. So today we will ponder on what we really mean by the term Indian writing in English, and how is it that English became a language that actually established itself in India. It's a language that is not an Indian language. It is a language that came with the colonizer. But today, the way we look at English as a language, it is an Indian English that we are looking at. So, which raises a lot of questions. So, what is Indian writing in English? Followed by a very important question: what is Indian English, and is the way in which English is used in the context of India, is it different from, let's say, the way it is used in the other countries? And by other countries, I don't mean the West, but let's say in the other developing countries. If English is there today as a kind of global language, are there variations based on the country? Are there variations based on the context? So these are some of the important points that we need to think about, and because they will find, these variations will also find their way into literature and the way in which literature is written. So the context is Indian. Is the context Indian? That's another very important question, because when we go back to the beginnings, we might probably get different answers to this question. But to begin at the beginning, we pick up a very, very controversial issue, which is about Macaulay's Minute on Education, which actually is the beginning point. So, one can call it as a kind of epistemic moment back in 1835. So, we are talking about the beginning of the 19th century, but a moment, whether correct or not, it changed the linguistic landscape of the country. And, English gradually established itself as a language that, as per the 8th schedule of the Constitution of India, it was supposed to be a language that would stay on for 15 years, but it has continued to this date. So it's interesting to note that we are all familiar with Macaulay's famous Minute on Education, and how the sum of 1 lakh rupees, it was decided, was to be given to the development of writing in English and not in the Indian languages. So it's interesting to note that this was actually also related to the medical college and the establishment of the Calcutta Medical College as against the NMI, which was the National Medical Institution. So, where the Orientalists like John Tytler actually wanted medical education to be available in translation. Macaulay thought otherwise, and the governor of the time, William Bentinck, supported Macaulay, and English came in. So, of course, there are different points of view to the minute, and probably what is important here is not about the aptness of it all, but the fact that this is a moment in history. And this is a moment in history that, of course, at the expense at times of the Indian languages, it brought English into the Indian world in a very important way. So, it means that language had a very significant role to play also in terms of bringing not just English as a language, but also a Western idea of modernity to India in the form of the study of English literature, and subsequently the writing in English. So, before we carry this debate further, I'll request Professor Prakash to share his views on the fact that we go back to that very important moment, and a moment that has given us the language. Of course, it's mired in controversy, but that is not important. What is important is, according to me, the fact that this is where it all started.
No, no, I think this is the point from where we should begin, and the English language has a history, and there is that important point that you have mentioned, Macaulay's Minute, and there is a whole point of view enshrined in that particular document, and it occurs in all the discussions that happen about Indian writing in English, starting in the 19th century. Of course, what you refer to as the social background, the governor and the others, having their own point of view and perspective on the English language, all that is very important. And today, in fact, it's a historical moment that you refer to, which determines the course of action so vis-a-vis the English language in India. And I believe that in the 19th century, there was a kind of requirement of the colonial power earlier as a company, but later on as the English nation itself in 1857 or 58. England assumes, that kind of parliamentary power, the constitutional power, and India becomes the regular colony, and they required a language of their own. So that is the beginning, but as you rightly say, it's not as simple as that. There have to be things like Indian writing in English, in Indian society, its image, and modernity, the most important point, that 19th century has to be different from the 18th century. Things have gone forward for better or for worse, and then if there is something that is required in India at that point of time, it is modernity, as you rightly say. So modernity, the introduction of the language, a new point of view, the Indian conditions, requirements, all those things come together in order to form a particular view which will be totally different from what existed earlier. And Indian languages themselves have to be kept in perspective, because after all, when Indians learn a new language to express themselves in, then they also require their knowledge about literatures that are there written through the Indian languages before that. So it's a ticklish thing, as you say. It's not easy to answer these questions. It's a very complex situation, and I think for the beginning you have struck the right note.
Yes. So it's interesting also that you mention the mutiny, the revolt of 1857, and if we connect, if we look at it from from Macaulay's Minute onwards, the whole idea of allocating a sum of money towards development of literature and knowledge systems in English, and as against the money that was to be allocated to development in the Indian languages. So that it of course did, it dealt a certain blow. But as it is important, when we talk about Indian writing in English, how did English come into the country and how did it establish itself? So it's important to go back to that particular moment and to trace it from there on. And we are talking about modernity, so it's interesting that, of course, English then works in both ways. One, that it's a complex process. So one, that it is a language of the colonizers, and gradually, as India becomes a colony of the British Empire, it's under the crown. So the culture and the system of the colonizer gradually permeates itself in the country through English as a language. And at the same time, a lot of the resistance movements, a lot of resistance groups, they use English as a language to counter the colonizer. So it's an interesting way in which this language works, I think, in the 19th century, a time period when we also have a lot of reform movements that go on in India. So any study, any analysis of the language actually has to be looked at in this context. And here, before we actually look at some of the seminal texts, in a sense, the firsts in English, it would be good to actually carry this debate forward. So, because we need to interrogate this, the entry and the establishment of English in terms of, a historical episode, and how to look at it in terms of its complexity in this context. So, it's necessary to, really speaking, place Indian English and writing, Indian writing in the English language within a cultural problematic, that is, in a sense, it's flexible, it's porous, because it's also partaking, as Professor Prakash just mentioned, that, they would the Indians at that time, in the 19th century, would probably approach the language through the bhashas, through what their own language is, and to actually enter the space of English through one's own language. And that, of course, also brings us, into different linguistic registers. It brings us into different kind of cultural encounters. And of course, it is one of the most, oft quoted, documents, which is the writer Raja Rao's foreword to his novel Kantapura, which was written in 1937. And the foreword, actually, that 1.5 page expresses this complexity, expresses this coming together of different sensibilities through different languages very well. So to quote from the foreword, where Rao says that there is no village in India, however mean, that has not a rich Sthal Purana or a legendary history of its own. Some god or godlike hero has passed by the village. Rama might have rested under the peepal tree. Sita might have dried her clothes after her bath. Carries on with the stories from the epic, and of course talks also about the Mahatma on one of his many pilgrimages through the country. So we are talking about a country that is rich. We are a country that have, our primary epics. So, might have slept in this hut, the low one by the village gate. And so he says, in this way, the past mingles with the present. And what you have is, to make the repertory of your grandmother always bright. And so he says one such story, when he talks about his novel Kantapura, he says one such story from the contemporary annals of my village I have tried to tell. So, and he uses a woman's voice to do so. And it's interesting that Raja Rao had written this novel while he was not in India, but he was in France at the time. And he talks about his experience, and he says, the telling has not been easy. One has to convey in a language that is not one's own the spirit that is one's own. So the references to, the mythologies and different ideas of, Indian culture. He says to translate all that into a language that is essentially alien, to the native. He says it's very difficult to do this. So this telling is not easy, because the language is not one's own, but the spirit is one's own. So how, and Indian writing in English in its beginnings, of course it has evolved, it has matured, today it's established itself as a genre on its own. But to look at it in terms of the beginnings, the question that is to be asked is, how do these two things come together? A spirit that is Indian, and how is it conveyed in a language that does not emerge from India? So he says one has to convey the various shades and omissions of a certain thought movement that looks maltreated in an alien language. So he says, I use the word alien. Yet, English is not really an alien language to us. And this is again a very important point because he's writing back in 1937, early 20th century. So, the experience of English is already there. So, it's pretty much, if we look at it from 1835 to 1935, in this span of 100 years, English through, interestingly, a lot of the resistance movements, through literature, English is there in some form. So he says it's not really an alien language because he says it is the language of our intellectual makeup. And he says earlier, of course, it was Sanskrit or Persian, but he says still, despite the fact that it is part of our intellectual makeup, Raja Rao says that this is not probably part of our emotional makeup, which means that there is a cultural sensibility, there is an emotional sensibility, there is a linguistic sensibility. How do these, really speaking, converge in terms of, the beginnings in Indian English literature? So he says one of the things that comes in handy, he says, is that the fact that we are all instinctively bilingual. Of course, in fact, one should say that, back in the day, people would be multilingual actually. And today, of course, we are probably reduced to being bilingual. But all are instinctively bilingual, and many of us, he says, who are writing in our language and in English. So we cannot write, he says, like the English. We should not, but we should write as Indians. So, which means that the language also creates the space whereby, in terms of the alteration of the cultural context, we are looking at a different kind of interaction. So, Professor Prakash, if you would like to add to this very famous document, and one can't really talk about the development of English in India without referring to Raja Rao's foreword to his novel Kantapura.
No, it's very important that Raja Rao writes at a time when English has already been there for 100 years.
Yes.
Technically speaking,
Technically speaking.
it might have been there earlier also. Like Hindu College in Calcutta would be, I think, in 1810, 1815 or so, and some kind of language has already entered. But the point that you are making is that there is a solid, concrete, 100-year-old history of language from 1835 to 1935, when Raja Rao is grappling with the idea of what you call the spirit. So that spirit is important, in fact, and very rightly you have picked up this word. The spirit has to be of the writer. The spirit has to be of the neighbor of the writer, the entire atmosphere of the writer, and Raja Rao then becomes a kind of agent of that spirit by capturing it in the Indian context. So Indian English is actually of a period and of a character that is Indian, that is rooted in the Indian reality. So and that requires a very vast amount of knowledge and different perspectives, and all those perspectives will clash with one another, and yet finally the spirit in its concrete form will be captured. So I believe that is what is meant by these 100 years, and the spirit which is Indian and the language which is alien, as you say, but the language also is finally being internalized and is rendered Indian English.
Indian English.
So
And the novel, I mean, if one reads today, of course, we might think that Kantapura is really, why should one go back to Kantapura? It's important to go back to Kantapura because it is a novel that if we talk about a certain kind of social realism that is there, in the Indian novel in English, we see it in Kantapura, the way he describes this village in southern India, and how the people of that village are totally influenced by the national movement and by Mahatma Gandhi's call for Satyagraha and so on. So all these factors are there, and then the descriptions. the description of the village in terms of its different communities, different streets that are, named after the communities. So, like, the Potter Street is different, the Weaver Street is there. So, different kind of levels that are there in the society. All that is written by Raja Rao, in English. So he says that our method of expression has to be a dialect which will someday prove to be as distinctive and colorful as the Irish or the American. And he says only time can justify this. So another aspect, in terms of the issue of language that he talks about is how the tempo of Indian life has to be infused into the English expression. And the word tempo here is important because we are also looking at not just Indian life but Indian culture. It is the tempo of the Indian culture that has to be infused into the English expression, just as today when we say this is British English and this is American English and this is the Irish form and so on. So similarly, there has to be a kind of move towards infusing into the English language the whole idea of the Indian cultural sensibility and way of life. So, that tempo, so he says that in India we think quickly and we talk quickly and we move quickly. So, there is something of that has to be there. And he again, he winds up his forward by connecting it to the primary epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and how there are these endless stories, and what is the format of these epics, and how all this really needs to be, one can see that somewhere Raja Rao is looking at connections that would be possible. And so he says that there are several episodes, and so thousands of episodes rather, so episode follows episode. And so he says this is our style of storytelling, and he says he uses the Indian style of storytelling in the English language. So I think with terms like how the language is alien, the intellectual makeup is different, the emotional makeup is there, the tempo of Indian life, and finally the style of storytelling. So Raja Rao is also making it quite clear that he is not going to compromise anywhere when it comes to bringing in the Indian cultural context into this language. So and he says that this novel Kantapura could be a story told of an evening as the dusk falls, and you would be in a veranda and a grandmother might be telling you the sad tale of her village. So these are some of this forward gives us, really speaking, the key into understanding Indian English writing at a time when pretty much as discussed that the language has already been there technically for about 100 years.
Friends, in this part of the discussion, we have talked about the Professor Payal Nagpal has made the point regarding the emergence, the introduction of English language in India in the 19th century, and then it flowered into its own. And when Raja Rao wrote 100 years later than Macaulay's Minute, then the required path had already been searched for and found. And that required path is the Indian tradition, the Indian epic, the Indian storytelling, and the Indian audience. So for all Indian things, you are writing in a language which is not Indian, but then finally, maybe in those 100 years, this language also has been Indianized, and the references to the Irish or the American English. So the same is true about the Indian English. It has that element of English and that element of India. And it also, in the meantime, English also has been transformed into something else. Yes. It's not the British English, as we call it. So in the next part of the discussion, we'll be taking up the issue further, and in theoretical terms also, and then Professor Payal Nagpal will expand on these points still further. Thank you.